Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to embark on a journey of great prophetical significance. I say great significance because so many people are asking, how close are we to the rapture? The one event most born-again Christians are looking forward to. For some reason, folks are slowly, once again, looking back to the prophecies found in the Holy Scriptures in an attempt to discern the signs of the times. However, that can be a very difficult thing to figure out since most of the churches and even many seminaries are no longer interested in teaching. So where do we look for answers then? Who can we turn to? Fortunately, we do have a brother that has been looking into the prophecies for over 37 years now. His name is Doc Marquis. Doc Marquis has a most unique background. He was raised in a family who were part of the Order of the Illuminati. For over 20 years, he studied very hard in order to reach a leadership level in the Illuminati. He became a third-level witch, or what's properly known as a master witch. Having served in the U.S. Army at the end of the Vietnamese conflict, Doc went to the American Academy of Health Sciences at Fort Sam in Houston, Texas. After finishing 2 tours of duty, Doc was honorably discharged and returned back home, where he continued in the Illuminati. However, God had a different plan for Doc. In Doc's own words, for 3 very long years, I became surrounded by born-again Christians who were constantly witnessing to me. It would take 3 years, but at the end of those 3 years, Doc finally understood what the Christians had been telling him all along in light of what he had been doing in the Illuminati. And it was on April 15th, 1979, that Doc walked into a Christian church as a sold-out slave of Satan. But on that same day, Doc left as a born-again child of the King. Even though Doc already had received a medical degree in the Army, Doc wanted to go back to school and receive his Christian education. He enrolled at Louisiana Baptist University, where he received his letters in sociology. For over 37 years now, Doc has been an active member of the church. He started youth ministries, worked in prison ministries, taught Sunday school classes, just to name a few. He has also appeared and consulted for national and international television shows, such as The Oprah Winfrey Show, 2020, The Geraldo Rivera Show, Unsolved Mysteries, Hard Copy, Inside Edition, and dozens more. He has also spoken on more than 1,000 radio shows. He has produced 19 DVDs to date and has written several books. So without any further ado, allow me to introduce to you Mr. Doc Marquis.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our brand new DVD, which is called How Close Are We? We are at Chapter 1, which is called Learn the Parable of the Fig Tree. Something is going on in the prophetical realm, something you can almost sense. It's almost as if prophetical ripples are gently flowing through the cosmos, trying to get our attention. It's almost tangible, something that you can sense in the air. Now, for myself, personally speaking, I've been sensing this prophetical ripple for over 5 years now, and I'm convinced it has something to do with the next rapture, something I personally feel will soon occur. And the one question for those of you who can also sense this change coming, is how close are we? How close are we, ladies and gentlemen, to the next rapture? Now, that's a tough question, but not an impossible one to answer. And before we go on, let me point out a very important fact. According to the Bible, in Matthew 24:36, it reads, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only." This verse is telling us that no man, but God only, God himself now, only knows the exact split second in which the next rapture shall hit. So if anyone tries to tell you that, this is the time or this is the date for the next rapture, call him a liar and a false prophet, because God's word tells us that only he knows when he will send his son to gather up his children at the next rapture. In this DVD, I will not be going over whether or not this next rapture is going to be pre, mid, or post, or as some people are calling it now, the pre-wrath, which as far as I'm concerned is just another name for the old pre-mid. I've already covered all these different perspectives in a prior DVD, which is called Which Rapture Are We Waiting For? Suffice it to say that the next rapture, as with all other previous ones, will be a pre-tribulation rapture. There was a biblical pattern which demands this is so. Our ancient brethren wrote of nothing but a pre-tribulation rapture all the way up to the 19th century, when the teaching was attacked by Satan and became perverted. Nevertheless, Christian history has taught us for almost 2 millenniums now that the next rapture is a pre-tribulation event. Having said all that, ladies and gentlemen, we need to find a prophetical marker, something, a place in the prophetical line where we can begin to cover and understand what is going on in the prophetical realm. The best place I feel we can begin our trek will be Israel. Israel is what I call the impossible nation. By any secular standard, the state of Israel should not exist. It just really shouldn't. Let's turn our attention to the history of Israel in order to understand why this will be our starting point. And it's about 30 AD, and you live in Jerusalem. And you know, at this point in history, the nation of Israel has had a very difficult past, to say the least. Around 1000 BC, King David ruled over Judea and its capital, which had been Jerusalem. David ruled over Judea along with the areas that would have included Israel and the West Bank. This would have constituted the first United Kingdoms in that area that was a Jewish kingdom. King Solomon took over the kingdom when his father David had died around 931 BC, and the kingdom was divided into 2 separate parts after Solomon had died. You had the southern part, which would be Judea, and the northern part, which would be Israel. A little bit more than 2 centuries later, around 722 BC, the Assyrians invaded the northern kingdom of Israel and deported the Jewish people to other parts of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were from the northern part of Mesopotamia, or what is northern Iraq today. Once the invasion was over with, the kingdom of Israel was no more. About 136 years later, in 586 BC, after Assyria had fallen, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II conquered Jerusalem. Only the most influential Jews of Judea would be deported to Babylon, which is southern Mesopotamia, which is modern Iraq. At the same time, the temple which Solomon had built unto God was destroyed. In 538 BC, King Cyrus of Persia, Persia being modern-day Iraq, had conquered the whole of the Babylonian Empire. King Cyrus had allowed the Jewish exiles to return back to their homeland and accepted what is best understood as a Jewish home rulership in Jerusalem. At the same time, once the Jewish people had settled back in their homeland, they rebuilt the Temple of Solomon, or what is also known as the Second Temple. About 2 centuries later, around 332 BC, the Greek ruler Alexander the Great destroyed the Persian Empire and automatically gained control over Judea. After the death of Alexander the Great, the empire was divided into three parts. As a result, the Jews got stuck in between the competing Greek rulers. 164 BC, a Jewish tribe of people known as the Maccabees revolted against the Greek Empire. 22 years later, in 142 BC, the Jews won their independence. And from 142 BC to around 63 BC, Judea was once again an independent Jewish state. In 63 BC, the Romans invaded Greece and also conquered the Seleucid Empire in the Middle East, which meant the Jews were once again subjugated. They were given a certain amount of autonomy in Jerusalem, but in reality, Judea was ruled from Rome. In 37 BC, the Jewish people rebelled against the Roman Empire and failed. Judea was turned into a province of Rome, and then Rome installed the Jewish king Herod the Great as its administrator. In 4 BC, Herod the Great had died. His son Herod Antipas became the new king and administered Galilee in the north and Perea to the east, which is the east bank of the Jordan River, which today is part of the kingdom of Jordan. This is the same Herod Antipas of the Holy Scriptures. It would have been the same Herod who met with the Magi when they were inquiring about the birth of the new king of the Jews, which we all know is Jesus Christ. The whole of this event can be found in Matthew chapter 2. Now let's go back to the future a little, back to 30 AD. For most of the past 7.5 centuries, the Jewish people were exiled, enslaved, dispersed, constantly being invaded and conquered, subjugated around a dozen and a half times, or at least half a dozen times, and finally ruled over by King Herod Antipas, who was only a puppet administrator of the of the Roman Empire. So here it is, 30 AD, and if you're Jewish, you well know that most of your history has been a dismal one. Jewish history, in my opinion, had been taken off course. The history of the Jews should have been, of absolute glory, the likes of which the world had never seen. But what caused the history of the Jewish people to become derailed? Where did it all go wrong? And believe it or not, it's really quite an easy answer. The Jewish people, and don't get me wrong, I love all my Jewish friends and everything, but the Jewish people had it coming to them because they had asked for it. Originally, the Jewish people were under a theocracy, a rulership directly under God. But no, they decided they wanted to be like everyone else and have a monarchy, rulership under a king. And the rest, as they say, is history. Again, it's somewhere around 30 AD, more or less, and your history has been a tumultuous one at best. Well, you have one thing, at least, that is still solidifying you and others as a people, and that would be the Second Temple. The Second Temple would have been one of the most incredible structures throughout the entire region. It had massive outer walls that were thick and which ran around the entire Temple Mount. Nowadays, we can only guess at what must have been its original splendor in all its glory. Now, imagine for a moment that an ordinary man with around 12 of his friends had gone into the Second Temple and left afterwards. This man's friends began to show him the buildings in and around the temple. And while he looks at all of it, the man turns around and declares, "There shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now that's in Matthew 24:2. Obviously, we're speaking of Jesus Christ. Imagine overhearing this conversation, that this magnificent, this glorious second temple is going to be thrown down. Considering the history that you and your people have been through, the prospects of having the second temple destroyed would have been horrifying. 4 decades later, after tolerating one Jewish uprising after another, Emperor Vespasian sent his eldest son, Titus, to take care of the Jewish uprisings once and for all. Now, Titus was a well-renowned war leader and hero in the eyes of the Romans. And it was given to him to deal with the situation. And let me tell you, if you studied the background of Titus, Titus was one of those military leaders that if he decided he was going to deal with something, he would really deal with it. So it was in 69 AD, the armies of Titus surrounded Jerusalem. For the next year, the armies of Titus kept Jerusalem surrounded. They had also cut off all of the outside food and water supplies. So it would only be a matter of time, but by next year in 70 AD, Titus and his armies broke the outer walls and attacked. According to the ancient historian Josephus, when Titus and his armies entered Jerusalem, they killed more than 1 million people, most of whom were Jewish. Almost 100,000 more were captured and enslaved. Evidence of this enslavement may be found. Titus was crowned Emperor of Rome in 79 AD. And that would have been about 9 years after he destroyed the Second Temple and took Jerusalem. One of his greatest achievements as emperor was the completion of the famous Colosseum of Rome. Many historians believe that the Great Colosseum was built by Jewish slaves, and if so, more than likely the captured Jews from Jerusalem. The destruction of the Second Temple was foretold by Christ 4 decades before it had happened. Two things we need to take note of at this point. Matthew 24, Christ foretold that not one stone of the Second Temple would be left one upon another. All of the stones would be thrown down. In other words, the entire structure of the Second Temple would be brought down. There is a controversy among historians about the destruction of the Second Temple. The first one, let's go back to the famous historian Josephus. He claims that the destruction of the temple began when one of the Roman soldiers threw a torch inside of its walls, which started a fire, which, when some city or town was under attack, that would be considered a normal or expected method of warfare. You just burn the place down. Others state that it was Titus's intention all along to destroy the Second Temple. One thing is certain. All the stones that were a part of the Second Temple were quite literally pulled apart, and the destruction of the temple, the Second Temple, was complete. Now, another question really does come to mind here when I think about some of the things I learned about this. See, I believe personally that there's more merit in the belief that Titus intended to to destroy the Second Temple all along, and here's why. Back in the mid-'80s, I knew a historian who had traveled extensively throughout the Middle East and, for all of his life, really. And he told me a story that he had learned from the native people who told him that the Second Temple was purposely destroyed, and why. There was an old myth, a legend if you would, in those early days, which stated that the legendary wealth of King Solomon and the temple treasures hadn't vanished. As history taught us, for some reason we think all the gold, the silver, everything just mysteriously got up and left. But according to that ancient legend, Solomon's wealth and the temples were covered by the mortar that was used to cement each of the temple stones together. In other words, they took the treasure, melted it, poured it in between the bricks and covered it with mortar, and then put the stones on top. Now, Titus had heard of this story when he besieged Jerusalem and once he destroyed the city. He ordered that every stone of the Second Temple be pulled apart. Titus believed that all of Solomon's gold could be found in between, those huge blocks, but nothing had ever been found. So the mystery of where the treasure, well, it's still a mystery, a mystery to this very day. Nevertheless, as Christ stated would happen in Matthew 24:2, all of the stones of the Second Temple had been quite literally pulled apart and thrown down. And as Christ had also forewarned, the Second Temple was not only destroyed, but for the most part, Israel as a nation would be destroyed, and the Jewish remnants would eventually be scattered throughout the world. It appeared that the state of Israel would end up as a distant memory, a footnote in the annals of history. However, another prophecy which the Lord had given would come into play. But that prophecy wouldn't come about for almost 2,000 years. Now let's get into chapter 2, which is called A Slow Return. For more than 1,800 years, Israel had become a memory, a byword, a place in the distant, ancient world that had its moment in the sun, but that had come and gone. And it would have remained as such were it not for a prophecy that was going to happen. In Matthew chapter 24, verses 32 through 34, Mark 13, 28 through 30, and Luke 21, 29 through 32, the Lord says, "Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender, and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled." Mainstream Christian theology teaches us that the fig tree represents Israel and that the budding of its leaves is referring directly to the return of Israel as a nation. However, because it had originally rejected Christ as the prophesied Messiah, the return of Israel as a state was going to come with heavy birth pains. Beginning in the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had ruled Palestine as part of its Syrian province once they had conquered the entire Middle East. During that time, there had been a Jewish presence in that part of the world, especially in the 4 holy cities of Safed, Tiberias, Hebron, and Jerusalem. By the 1880s, there was approximately 25,000 Jewish people living in those areas. However, due to the persecution of the Jewish people towards the latter part of the 19th century, especially in Russia, the Jewish people began to emigrate, and many of them did so to Palestine. Somewhere around, I think it was 25,000 Jewish people had immigrated to Palestine in 1880. But by the end of the 19th century, the population of the Jewish people in the Palestinian area had doubled to 50,000. During the same time, a political movement known as Zionism began to take root. In 1896, a book entitled Der Judenstaat, or The Jewish State, had been published. Written by Theodor Herzl, the book, The Jewish State, described a modern-day social democratic society in which the Jews would live in peace and self-determination. In the 2012 edition, page 157, the following quote, I believe, says it all. I believe that a wondrous generation of Jews will spring into existence. The Maccabees will rise again. Let me repeat once more my opening words. The Jews who wish for a state will have it. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our own homes. The world will be free by our liberty, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness. And whatever we attempt there to accomplish for our own welfare will react powerfully and beneficially for the good of humanity. And it was this same sentiment that inspired many Jewish people to return back to their homeland. Thus, the movement of Zionism began. Now, the Zionist movement is basically the political goal of creating a Jewish state in order to create a nation where the Jewish people would be the majority rather than the minority as they had been in other nations during their diaspora. Now, major aspects of Zionism is reflected in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. Now, let me just cite you a couple of quick examples here. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it through their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. Impelled by this historic and traditional attachment, Jews strove in every successive generation to reestablish themselves in their ancient homeland. In recent decades, they returned in their masses. Now, a furor of Zionism hit the Jewish people in 1896 with the publishing of the book, The Jewish State. Now, this furor grew to such proportions that in 1897, the first Zionist Congress had been held in Basel, Switzerland. Theodor Herzl and other Zionist leaders sought the backing of major powers, the Ottoman Empire, Germany, and England. However, only England seemed interested in such an idea. Another wave of Jewish immigration occurred between 1904 and onwards to the end of World War I. Once again, the Russians were out to destroy the Jewish people because, the Russians, had socialist perspectives on government and felt that this made the Jewish people inferior. As a result, Jewish organizations were collecting donations from all over the world in order to buy land so that the newly immigrated Jews could buy land